be moderating the first session, and then Professor Anna will be moderating the second session. Okay, and it's 3 p.m. here. I just want to say hello and welcome to all of you. I'm speaking to you from Malaysia. It's 3 p.m. I believe Beijing is 3 p.m. as well. And Professor Paul is with us at Queensland. It's about 5 p.m. I'm not too sure what time it is at Pakistan right now.
It's
Geneva.
noon.
Dr. Hassan, what time is it now,
It's
Pakistan?
it's noon here. It's noon here.
It's snow.
Yeah.
Okay. So without further ado, I'd like to now start today's forum and also this afternoon session on this very important subject. It's called Promotion and Protection of Minority Rights and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I believe we have got three sort of topics that we want to deal with. We may not cover everything, but this is what it is that we like to address. The protection of minority rights in the context of UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of great power competition, and also the promotion and protection of minority rights in the era of artificial intelligence. So that is what we are set up to work on. So I do not want to take away too much time. And let's begin with the welcoming addresses by first inviting Mr. Ko Kinki, the president of East West Bridge, to have his welcoming remarks. Kinki, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Distinguished speakers, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this forum. We are honored to have a panel of distinguished speakers to deliberate on the promotion and protection of minority rights and how it will contribute to UN's Sustainable Development Goals. As stated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are entitled to the full enjoyment of human rights, irrespective of the ethnicity and religion, whether they are a majority or minority in the community. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, which encompass a holistic approach to development in addressing poverty, health, education, equality, and environment, envision a world where no one is left behind. However, the reality is that minority communities often face systemic barriers and discrimination due to historical prejudices or out of domestic political calculations. As we strive for a more inclusive and equitable world, it is important to recognize that the well-being of minority is not just a moral imperative, but a cornerstone for achieving sustainable development. By ensuring that minorities have equal access to opportunities, resources, and decision-making process, we will be able to create a more just and equitable society. Protecting minority rights thus strengthens social cohesion and fosters a culture of peace and mutual respect. Ladies and gentlemen, the promotion and protection of minority rights are essential to the realization of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, let us reaffirm our commitment to creating a world where every individual, regardless of their identity, can thrive and contribute to a sustainable and prosperous future for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kinki. Thank you for reminding us that minority rights is the cornerstone of a stable and strong economic world order. This forum is co-organized by East West Bridge and also Global Governance Institution and also DCAF. And now we have Dr. Albert Schnockmo, head of the Asia Pacific Unit, DCAF, to present his welcoming remarks. Albert, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Greetings from DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance in Geneva, in Switzerland. It's an honor to join East West Bridge, the International Association of Human Rights and Social Development, and the Global Governance Institution in this effort to bring together an international group of experts and distinguished participants for this forum on the promotion protection of minority rights and the UN SDGs. I believe this is a great initiative, and thank you very much for this opportunity. As we all know, some of the big or the major hallmarks of each society and the political system that the society selects to govern the population are to serve the collective interest and strive for development, security, and stability of its population at home and also humankind abroad. And in doing so, apply the majority rule, but always with sufficient protection of minorities, including their cultural, their social, ethnic, religious heritage, and of course, their human rights. And also to invest in good governance at all levels and areas of public policy and public services, especially when it comes to the security institutions in society. And this is the link also to our work at DCAF. And here the basic principles of the governance of a society's security sector include the protection and the participation of minorities and marginalized groups in the provision of security. The UN's 2030 agenda, so the Sustainable Development Goals, say that, and here I quote, "Sustainable development cannot be realized without peace and security and security will be at risk without sustainable development." And it also says that the new agenda recognizes the need to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies that provide equal access to justice and that are based on respect for human rights, including the right to development, on effective rule of law and good governance at all levels, and on transparent, effective, and accountable institutions. So the 2030 agenda recognizes that sustainable development goes hand in hand with peace and security. And at the same time, the absence of sustainable development is a key driver to inequality, fragility, and even conflict at home and abroad. And this tight nexus between security and development has been expressed through the inclusion of SDG, the goal 16 in the 2030 agenda. And SDG 16 stresses the need for strong institutions that are built on respect for human rights, effective rule of law, and good governance at all levels. And good security sector governance can be instrumental in providing guidance for the achievement of SDG 16 and its targets, because it defines how the principles of good governance apply to public security provision, management, and oversight. And those principles of good security sector governance include accountability, transparency, the rule of law, participation, responsiveness, effectiveness, and efficiency. And establishing good security sector governance is the goal of security sector reform. So change processes towards the improvement of the work of the security sector. And supporting societies and states to achieve that is the bread and butter of our work here at DCAF. So at DCAF, we're committed to making people and societies more secure through accountable and effective security and justice. And in addition to working with national security actors, from the military to the police, to private security companies, from parliaments to ministries, to civil society organizations, media, or think tanks, we promote international cooperation in the area of security sector governance and reform. And we also believe that international cooperation on such sensitive topics can help in building trust and confidence, and that really lies at the heart of all efforts to prevent conflict and violence. And with these goals in mind, our Asia-Pacific team at DCAF, we assembled a regional network of partner institutions and experts. And in China, this is Tian's Global Governance Institution. Our regional network offers opportunities to exchange experiences, to help each other during reform processes, to share and learn from successful and not so successful practices and experiences. And it helps the network partners to create a more reliable and accountable security sector that brings sustainable peace and stability to their own societies throughout the region. And that then is the foundation for sustainable development. And in closing, I look forward to today's presentations and discussions, and thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schnabel. Thank you so much for underscoring how important security is to sustainable development, and security encompasses the protection of minority human rights. Thank you so much. That will end our welcoming addresses, and now we will move to the main part of this afternoon session, which is the presentation and moderated discussion. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Peter Cheng. I am the research director of the East-West Bridge. I'll be moderating the session this afternoon, the first session for this afternoon. And today, right now, we have our first speaker, and Isabella Zaleski Mori, a human rights advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people. Isabella will be speaking to us via a recorded video. Isabella. I think we have some sound problem. We can't hear it. We have problem hearing the recording.
Consultant on Human Rights, and please accept the National Association for Human Rights and Social Development. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to participate in this event in my personal capacity as International Consultant on Human Rights, and please accept my sincere appreciation for the East-West Bridge, the International Association for Human Rights and Social Development, and for all the institutions co-organizing this forum for the initiative and attention to this very important subject on the promotion and protection of minority rights and SDGs. Allow me to start by kindly emphasizing that I'm participating here today, again, in my personal capacity as an international consultant on human rights, and my participation is not affiliated with my current or any other previous professional engagements that I've had. Minorities are often discriminated against and are socially, economically, politically, and culturally marginalized by society. People from caste-affected communities, especially children, are more disproportionately affected by malnourishment. Untouchability practices leading to segregation and prohibitions against food sharing are central components in the type of discrimination that Dalits and other caste-affected groups, for instance, face every day. Discrimination and social exclusion severely affect the health of children and women from marginalized groups, who are often prevented from accessing health services. People affected by caste discrimination are often forced to take on dangerous jobs with high health risks, and these jobs lead to infections, injuries, and death. In addition, marginalization of minority groups translates into considerable disparities in education opportunities, education attainment, and treatment by school teachers. This type of discrimination, paired with inadequate support in government schools and pressure to earn money, make them more likely to drop out, and therefore creating a self-sustaining system of discrimination against them. Throughout the years working on minorities and migrants issues, as well as refugee protection, I have noted that forcibly displaced and stateless persons who are members of minorities are affected both by discrimination by individuals in their communities and or at the national level before and during their displacement. They are victims of severe human rights violations, conflict, ethnic and/or religious persecutions, and these multiple forms of discrimination affect some members of the community more than others, particularly women, children, persons with disabilities, older persons, and LGBTIQ+T persons. The climate emergency, for instance, creates a survival threat and displacement risk for all. But when structural discrimination is combined with global scarcities, minorities are least likely to benefit from any mitigation of its worst effects. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, in addition to the human rights principle that prohibit discrimination and assert the equality of all persons, minorities have specific rights under the international human rights framework and under some regional and national laws. These affirm their rights to participate, to be included, enjoy their own culture, practice their own religion, and use their own language. From my personal perspective, national laws and legislation currently in place are not mindful of the traditions, practices, and customary laws of minorities and indigenous peoples. Respect and cultural sensitivity must always be shown, and there is also a need to identify community self-management structures among minorities and invest in supporting their capacity to develop community action plans that address the protection issues and concerns within their communities. When interacting and collaborating with CSOs working with minority rights as well as with minorities representatives, I have concluded that religious leaders and faith-based actors across the world have been making joint efforts to promote interreligious dialogue and multi-faith actions. Yet, members of religious or belief minorities continue to face intolerance, negative stereotyping, stigmatization, discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against persons based on religion or belief. Clear measures should be taken to address discrimination against religious or belief minorities, for example, in the job and housing markets, within criminal justice systems, and in national security responses. States should effectively counter religious profiling, act rapidly on hate crimes, and protect religious or belief minorities, including their places of worship. Dear colleagues, another pressing issue touching all corners of the globe is the protection and promotion of human rights under the AI era. Although AI has the potential to be beneficial to humanity, we need limits, so we need regulation. It has been brought to the attention to the international community that face recognition software more commonly misidentified African descent and Asian minorities, leading to false arrests in some countries of the global north. Software use in the criminal justice system has predicted that African descent offenders would have higher recidivism rates than they did. To be effective and to put people at the heart of the development of new technologies, I believe that any regulation must be grounded in respect for human rights, including the human rights of persons belonging to minorities. And this requires listening to those who are affected, women, minority groups, marginalized people, as they are in particular disproportionately affected by bias in AI. Serious efforts must be made to bring them to the table for any discussion on governance. I am strongly convinced that regulations need to require assessment of the human rights risks and impacts of AI systems before, during, and after the use. Transparency guarantees, independent oversight, and access to effective remedies are needed. Ladies and gentlemen, people must be prioritized over development if we want to avoid further exacerbating the expanding gap between the richest and the poorest members of society. And it remains clear that minorities, indigenous peoples, and especially women from these communities, are rarely at the center of strategies and initiatives to achieve the SDGs. There is little or no attention in SDGs measures and indicators to how minorities are treated or impacted in social and economic development terms. When it comes to empowering and promoting the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, the collection of data on grounds such as ethnicity, religion, or language are essential to measure the inclusion of marginalized and vulnerable groups such as African descent, Dalits, Roma, etc. Not acknowledging or taking into account ethnicity, religion, or language as key makers of social and economic exclusion risks masking the intersecting forms of discrimination that combine to exacerbate the marginalization of minority and indigenous women and the inequality they face in terms of benefiting from social and economic development. I strongly believe that it's crucial to increase monitoring on inequalities in the achievement of the SDGs based on ethnicity, religion, or language, including by collaborating with development actors, international human rights organizations, and United Nations entities. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to conclude by saying that states' international treaty obligations commit them not simply to prohibiting discrimination in law, but to eliminating it. Taking positive, proactive measures to tackle the cultural and social drivers of discrimination are indispensable elements of these obligations. If states are to fulfill their obligations and honor their commitments to eliminating discrimination and ensuring equality of participation, their efforts should encompass and go beyond combating prejudice, stereotypes, and stigma. The focus should be not only on countering negative social forces, but on actively promoting equal, diverse, and inclusive society. I will now conclude my intervention. I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I wish you all very fruitful discussions.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Thank you for presenting almost in a first person voice the rights of minorities, in particular those of women and children and those with disability. I particularly sort of struck or sort of reminded of how important technology has been when Isabella raised the question of AI software in terms of facial recognition that could lead to discriminations against minorities, which touches one of the topics that we want to discuss in this forum. Thank you once again, Isabella. And now we'd like to move on to our next speaker, which we are very privileged to have, Professor Powell speaking to us live from Queensland. Professor Powell, the floor is yours.
Look, thank you very much. If it's okay with you, I might just share a few slides, and it might just help focus some of, well, perhaps focus my remarks and help people follow along as well. You should be able to see on screen, hopefully, the cover page of my presentation. Look, first and foremost, though, let me thank the organisers of today's event to bring people from many parts of the world together to share their thoughts and to exchange knowledge and experience in the hope of contributing to achieving better outcomes in terms of the kinds of aspirations that I think, at least as matters of principle, underpin the agenda or the discourse of rights, and particularly the protection of minorities. I've called my talk today Rights in a Multipolar World with a question mark, with a subtitle, Beware the Golden Weasel, and I'll explain what that is as we progress through. And it's in large part because I've spent the best part of 50 years of my life experiencing, in many respects, certain dimensions or aspects of being a minority, and not only drawing on my own experiences, but also my research and observations about the successes or otherwise of the rights discourse to fulfill the ambitions that we have invested in them. So today's remarks really aim to, I guess, be a little bit provocative, with the aim of pushing us to think a little bit harder and a little bit more creatively around this space, because there isn't a doubt, and you'll see in my slide shortly, that despite the virtuous nature of the objectives articulated in the rights discourse, particularly as it's manifest since the Second World War, we live with significant and chronic disappointment. As I said, my subtitle is Beware the Golden Weasel, and it draws from a Chinese saying, which is 黄鼠狼给几百年，没安好心. And what that largely points to is that it's important to beware the weasel bearing gifts. And as good as many things sound, there's always more to the story than what you see on the cover. And I think the same challenges exist when it comes to the ways in which we think about not only rights discourse itself, but importantly, how those rights discourses actually become reality on the ground. So my talk really just has 5 simple provocations more than anything else. And they are really aimed at making us think a little bit. And I did them largely because it made me think. So hopefully they will be received in the spirit of sharing, and with the hope that they help push our collective imaginations further along this important piece of work. So provocation number 1 is that the notion of rights themselves are historical. And that gives rise to a number of challenges in the way that we approach these questions. It means that we need to be sensitive to the genealogy of what constitutes these rights and how we understand them to be, and the contexts that actually gave rise to them and that continue to give them life. Invariably, it means that we can't avoid the issues of the institutions and the political lenses through which rights discourse works their way through the global body politic and ultimately into the body politic of member states. The third thing it does is that it constantly forces us to think about the relationship between what we might have a sense of being the transcendental, the universal, and the particular. Now, from a transcendental point of view, I think it's probably fair to say that there is a general sense that the purpose of rights discourse is to contribute towards initiatives that will alleviate suffering and contribute to empowering people, whoever they are, whatever they are, wherever they are, to have the ability to lead fulfilling lives. That seems to me to be the transcendental component of rights discourse. The challenge, of course, is how that manifests in the particular, and that means understanding its history and its location in space and time. My second provocation is that, in fact, rights discourse as we understand it today has largely run its course. That's not to say that the issues of concern at a transcendental level are not of concern. In fact, quite the contrary, they are. It's to say that the ways in which we've thought about approaching them need to be reimagined. Rights discourse emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War and the emergence of a new set of international institutions aimed at creating a world order that would avoid the problems that led up to the Second World War, and which would address the problems that had beset the world in the previous 100 or even 200 or 300 years. But in doing so, the ideas that underpinned how we thought about and described rights was intimately entangled with the history of liberalism itself, and particularly liberalism as a colonial rationality. Liberalism has a long history in the West, both as a system of political thought, but also as a technology of governance and global political and economic intervention. As a form of colonial rationality, liberalism was anchored in practices that defined people in terms of what constituted civilized and what constituted barbaric. And at the heart of this intellectual, cultural endeavour that played out politically across the global stage was very particular views about what constituted a civilized individual. And within liberal discourse, this notion of a civilized individual was one that would be rational and capable of self-government and capable of extricating themselves from the constraints of the tribe, of the culture, and of the masses. Because without that ability, it would be impossible for this individual to not only govern themselves, but to form the basis of self-governing communities. Ultimately, as it was imbricated in networks of colonial power, these ideas of what constituted a civilized individual became enmeshed in a millenarian politics, where the mission, if you will, of liberalism was to civilize the barbaric and to transform the jungle into the garden. And so rights discourse became tightly interwoven with the idea that history had an overarching purpose and that there would be an end state, which would look something like the imaginations of the Western liberal political elite. Which ultimately led to what I would say is my third provocation, and that is that rights discourse has, notwithstanding its virtuous foundations in the immediate years after the Second World War, became increasingly weaponized. Between 1990 and 2019, a 30-year period that I think we could broadly call the 30 years of Pax Americana or the 30 years of American unipolarity, the United States actually initiated 3.7 military interventions per year on average. And those interventions were more intensive quantitatively and qualitatively compared to the period in between 1946 and 1989. In that period, the United States initiated 2.4 interventions per year on average. That was the quantitative side. Qualitatively, these interventions in the unipolar period were increasingly undertaken in the name of the protection or the advancement of some form of liberal rights, whether it was a notion of freedom, a notion of democracy, and a notion of liberty. So rights discourse became entangled not only from a history of the colonial enterprise, but in fact in a post-colonial context became ensnared in an American militarization and weaponization. So that's provocation number 3. Unsurprisingly, in that practical context, as opposed to the great context of human aspiration and ambition, the effect has been to elide the real problems of rights, the real problems of economic and social empowerment and cultural discrimination and racial discrimination, whereby the champions of the rights themselves were able to carry on as the great abusers. And they became, in many regards, a testament to the efficacy of power over the efficacy of virtuous ideas. And as the great abusers, we can see that in practical terms, as much as they would militarily intervene in other countries in the name of rights, they were themselves the worst when it came to protecting and advancing the rights of minorities in their own countries, as well as in the countries in which they intervened. The end result, sadly, was the undermining of the genuine pursuit of the improvement of the human condition. Now, this image is actually a contemporary image of Black Americans who are being frog-marched to continue working in the fields as effectively slave labour. That, by the way, is the accusation that's usually levelled by the Americans at other countries. And let me show you some images just to bring the point home. I won't talk too much to the specific images, but I want you just to soak them in, to get a sense of the gap between aspiration and reality. And of course, we see here the situation in Palestine today. We also see here the plight of Australian Aborigines in the top right, where alcoholism and drug abuse continues to deny these people the same living and lifestyle opportunities that others in the society experience. We have here the tangible consequences of the failure of rights discourse. In Australia, in the top right again, as well as in the tragedy of Palestine as it is today. But aside from war, we also have the incarceration of migrants in the top right-hand side, and we have homelessness in the streets of the UK and in the US and in Canada. And the homeless, of course, are outnumbered disproportionately by minorities, American Indians, and the traditional owners, the First Nations peoples of Canada. So we can see here the in-your-face consequences of the ineffectiveness, if you will, of rights discourse. Which brings me to my last provocation. And my last provocation, in some ways, is the most provocative. And that is that rights discourse has now become a tool of hegemony. Over the course of the last 70 years, a plethora of organisations have emerged, ostensibly funded with a mission of carrying out and implementing the ambitions of the rights discourse as we, as human civilizations across the world, articulated over 70 years ago. And yet, in practical terms again, many of these organs, these apparatuses, these bodies, have become the funded extensions of American foreign policy, wherein over the course of the last 20 years or so, in parallel to the explicit military interventions that I noted earlier, these agencies have been intimately involved in the organisation and the provocation of colour revolutions across the world. Unfortunately, the ambitions that I think we all share for the protection and advancement of rights have somewhere between the day when human civilizations came together and agreed to them as our objectives has become detached from how they are implemented and realised in reality. And as the global landscape is transforming from a world where American unipolarity dominated the geopolitical landscape to a world in which multiple powers and individual nations seek to assert sovereignty again. It behoves us to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to reimagine the substance of rights in the context of a multipolar world. And on that note, I end my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Paul. Thank you very much for the very provocative presentation. In some ways, I can, as I read it, it's an exercise of self-criticism in some part. As being an Australian yourself, looking inwards, and a very constructive provocation, constructive exercise of self-criticism for us as a whole, for those of us who have been working on human rights, and we got to ask ourselves where we stand in this. I particularly like the conceptual challenge that you posed to us on the idea of the individual and the self. As you would know, our former Prime Minister and former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir, has been talking about Asian values as another way of understanding human rights. This discourse is continuing, and I think it is something that we must continue to engage in a multipolar world as we come to a more nuanced and richer understanding of what human rights should be. Thank you so much, Professor Paul. I really appreciate your presentation. Now we'd like to move on to the next speaker, and we are very glad to have Dr. Malihaba Adan, Dean of the School of Foreign Languages in Xinjiang, presenting to us. Dr. Malihaba, are you speaking to us from Xinjiang? Dr.
Yes,
Malihaba, the floor is
me?
yours. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, good afternoon and good morning as well. It's such a great pleasure to be invited to participate in this forum. And my name is Malihaba Oran from Xinjiang University. And Xinjiang locates in the northwest part of China with more than 50 ethnic groups. And Uyghur is one of the ethnic groups in Xinjiang. As the previous speaker mentioned, that weaponization and the politicization of the human rights issues are common practice in the context of the great power competition. So human rights issue in Xinjiang has long been a focus of the anti-China discourse, and it is ridiculous that people who have never come to Xinjiang would use the term genocide to describe the living condition of Uyghurs. So today, being a Uyghur, I'd like to take this great opportunity to share with you the true condition of ethnic groups in Xinjiang from the perspective of population and education. First of all, I want to share some data related to the demographic changes in Uyghur population. Since the founding of the People's Republic of China, 7 censuses have been organized by the State Council. And from the first censuses in 1953 to the 6th census in 2010, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang increased steadily from 3.64 million to 10.07 million, with an increase of nearly 2.77 times, which has surpassed the growth rate of the national average. And according to the data from the 7th census, among the population of the permanent residents in Xinjiang, the population of Han accounts for 42.24%, while the population of Uyghur composes 44.96% of the total population. And between the 6th census and the 7th census, that is to say, from the year of 2011 to 2020, the total population of Xinjiang and the population of Uyghur have experienced respective increases of 18.5% and 16.2% compared to the statistics from the 6th census. And previously, I mentioned that the growth rate of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang has surpassed that of the national average. However, here, as you may say, that the data shows that the growth rate of the total population in Xinjiang surpassed that of Uyghur population. And one of the explanation of this is that the permanent resident population of Han experienced a growth of 2 million individuals, resulting in a growth rate of 24.86%. And this increase of the Han population primarily results from the migration of over 1 million individuals from other provinces. And actually in China, among the 31 provinces and the municipalities, 12 of them are the favorite destinations for migration, and Xinjiang is one of them. The top 3 are the coastal provinces and the municipality like Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Shanghai, with over 10 million migrant populations. And other favorite destinations for migration are Beijing, Jiangsu, Tianjin, Fujian, Hainan, etc. The primary factor for migration to Xinjiang can be contributed to the consistent social stability throughout recent years, which has established a strong basis for the swift economic growth. So consequently, there has been a substantial surge in individuals relocating to Xinjiang in search for investment prospects, company prospects, and job chances. And based on the data between the first and the second censuses, the annual growth rate of the Uyghur population was 8.2 per thousand. And from the second census to the sixth census, there was a noticeable increase in the growth rate of the Uyghur population, ranging between 16.4 per thousand and to 26 per thousand annually. And between the sixth and the seventh census, as you may say from the picture, there were changes in the growth rate of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. From the year of 2011 to 2017, the annual growth rate of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang remained high, between 13.7 per thousand to 25.7 per thousand. However, after the year of 2017, there has been a slowdown in the growth rate of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. And as for why, I'd like to explain based on the second point that I want to make. Xinjiang has experienced a continuous enhancement in the overall educational quality of the population. And from the second census to the seventh census, the number of the people in Xinjiang with college degree, high school degree, or technical secondary school degree, junior high school degree, and a primary school degree has increased markedly, as you may see from the chart. And the growth in the number of individuals with college degree is particularly noteworthy, as you may see the red bars in the column. Compared to the sixth census, data from the seventh census show that in Xinjiang, the number of individuals with a college degree surpasses the national average. The enhancement in the quality education in Xinjiang attributes to 34 favorite policies implemented and the substantial investment made by the central and the local governments. The policies consist of implementing 15 years of free compulsory education, providing funding guarantees for bilingual education in rural preschools for 3 years, implementing the 2 exemptions and 1 subsidy policy for compulsory education, enforcing the 3 exemptions and 1 subsidy policy for regular vocational education, offering financial aid to university students, providing vocational skill training for unemployed graduates from junior and senior high schools, and delivering living assistance to students from challenging family backgrounds, etc. Furthermore, there are 9 indirect subsidy policies that pertain to preferential public services, including health checkups for primary and secondary school students, subsidies for kindergarten public expenses, etc. And with the exceptions of the enhanced education level in Xinjiang, now I want to come back to the point that even though the total population of Uyghur in Xinjiang increases annually, there is a slowdown in the growth rate of Uyghur population in recent years. With more than 10 years of the partnership assistance from 19 provinces and the municipalities, the poverty alleviation initiatives in Xinjiang have made significant progresses, particularly in southern Xinjiang. There has been a substantial enhancement in the educational achievement and the cultural refinement of individuals across various ethnicities. The combination of increasing desire for material prosperity and the escalating consumer expenditure associated with raising children may have led to modifications and changes in how ethnic population see fertility. With the improvement of education level, ethnic population may have recognized that having a large number of children is no longer necessarily beneficial. And additionally, competition in employment opportunities may also contribute to the intrinsic shift in fertility perception among ethnic population. They may believe that having fewer children, but investing more resources in their education and the upbringing will better ensure their children's future competitiveness in the society. So to sum up, when looking at global population trend, as economic and social development advances, people tend to prioritize personal fulfillment and quality of life more, resulting in decreased fertility rate and the natural population growth rates. So what I want to say is that this transition that the Uyghur population is experiencing show more than just a change in population size. It may also indicate an overall enhancement of the human quality and the changing conception. So that is all, and thank you. And this year is the 100th anniversary of Xinjiang University. I sincerely welcome you to come to Xinjiang University to have a look on the condition of the education of ethnic people in Xinjiang. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miley Haba. I really appreciate your presentation. As you know, for those of us who are outside of China, Xinjiang is in the news all the time. But
Yes.
the sources of information and reports that we get tend to be from outside of China about Xinjiang. It's really nice to be able to hear directly from you, from Xinjiang University itself, giving us your own first-hand account, reporting of what's happening on the ground. And as much as you welcome us to visit Xinjiang, I think it's great if you could come to Kuala Lumpur and to report to us what exactly happening in Xinjiang, because we do want to have a fuller picture of what's happening in Xinjiang, and we tend not to get the full picture. And your presentations like this will help. Thank you again, Dr. Miley Haba. And now, without further ado, and last but not least, I'd like to invite our last speaker for this afternoon's session. Mahmoud has just briefly left the table. Dr. Mahmoud Ali is my colleague at the East-West Bridge. We are very comfortably situated in Kuala Lumpur. And I'm very pleased that Dr. Mahmoud Ali is able to join us for this afternoon discussion. Mahmoud, all set, the floor is yours. You got to unmute, Mahmoud.
I do apologize. Thank you, Peter, my colleague, friend, and moderator, friend, philosopher, guide, and East-West Bridge for inviting me to this forum, truly illuminating the presentations we have had so far. I am really gobsmacked. Great stuff. Thank you very much. Well, I look at Xizang, many foreigners still call it Tibet, as a case study of US lawfare or gray zone operations against China using ethnic minority leverages. Xizang hit the headlines just last month when President Biden signed the Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act, intervening in China's internal affairs. Biden called on Beijing, quote, to resume direct dialogue without preconditions with the Dalai Lama or his representatives to seek a settlement that resolves differences and leads to a negotiated agreement on Tibet, unquote. Representative Mike McCall, who led the enactment process in Congress, headed a congressional delegation visiting the Dalai Lama in India and pledged, quote, "We will not let that happen," unquote, about Beijing selecting the Dalai Lama's successor as though America exercised jurisdiction over Xizang. This was the culmination of a long US covert campaign to influence events in Xizang, while acknowledging Chinese suzerainty, but not sovereignty there. In this campaign, first launched in 1942 by Colonel William Donovan of the OSS, and later refined by the CIA, with support from India's intelligence bureau, thousands of Xizang's Kampa, Amdoa, and Golok guerrillas fought Chinese troops for nearly 2 decades until Richard Nixon ended US involvement in 1972. The CIA campaign's high point came in early 1959, and I'll explain why this is important. When a large, well-equipped guerrilla force tried to take the Dalai Lama into protective custody, triggering fierce Chinese resistance. The Dalai Lama, with his family and CIA armed escort, fled to India, promptly receiving asylum there. Chinese forces crushed the guerrillas, and the DCI, Alan Dulles, reported daily to Eisenhower in painful detail of defeat and loss. I'll give some details now from CIA records. 26 March 1959, quote, "Beginning on March 10 at Lhasa, there had occurred a series of events which led to the flight from Lhasa of the Dalai Lama, whom the Chinese communists were about to kidnap and carry off to Peiping. When the people of Lhasa became aware of this plan, thousands of Tibetans flocked to the city and took the Dalai Lama into protective custody. Disorders followed in Lhasa. A Chinese strongpoint was captured. The Dalai Lama supported the rebel activity. Peiping at first tried a policy of leniency, but subsequently was obliged to take strong measures. The rebels had abandoned Lhasa on March 24th, unquote. 1st April 1959. Dalai Lama, quote, "is probably headed toward the large lamasery at Tawang, which is located in Indian-controlled territory in Assam, claimed by both India and Communist China. Nehru wants Dalai Lama in the New Delhi area, where the two can be in close touch," unquote. 29th October 1959. Brother Gyalo Tonda, Dalai Lama's brother, brought Dalai Lama's message to Secretary of State Christian Herter, quote, "It was the hope of the Dalai Lama that the US government would continue to help the people of Tibet in the struggle for independence. He was grateful for the assistance from US sources for the Tibetan refugees. The Tibetans needed financial and arms assistance from the US in order to continue their resistance within Tibet against Chinese communist oppression," unquote. Combat waged from Nepal's Mustang enclave ended after the US-trained commander Gyato Wangdu was killed. But now, with the Dalai Lama approaching nirvana, his succession question gifted a new tool to America's information war on China. CIA's records of the paramilitary campaign bear insights into US thinking about China generally and Xizang particularly. So here is the document from 26 January 1968. Quote, "The CIA Tibetan program, parts of which were initiated in 1956, is based on US government commitments made to the Dalai Lama in 1951 and 1956. The program consists of political action, propaganda, paramilitary and intelligence operations, appropriately coordinated with and supported by the government of India." The India bit is redacted from the document. Program objectives are aimed toward lessening the influence and capabilities of the Chinese regime through support among Tibetans and among foreign nations of the concept of an autonomous Tibet under the leadership of the Dalai Lama, toward the creation of a capability for resistance against possible political developments inside Tibet, and the containment of Chinese communist expansion in pursuance of US policy objectives. The Cultural Revolution in China expanded into Tibet bringing with it tremendous disturbances, including the disruption of internal transportation, communication, travel, and to a significant extent, peace and order. Unfortunately, there are no apparent signs that the Tibetan people are capitalizing upon this internal chaos to seek further autonomy. Chinese security has shown no signs of deterioration, and the control over Tibet, both political and military, remains as pervasive as ever. Tibetan leadership has been purged, leaving the Chinese in direct control of the local administration, and a large number of underground assets have been uncovered and neutralized, unquote. So what happened next? Quote, at present, there are no radio teams remaining inside Tibet. Radio teams continue to function, unquote, south of Tibet. Quote, although much of their information comes from the debriefing of traders and refugees. The next bit is important. Singleton resident agent operations in Tibet, regarded as being the long-range replacement of the black radio teams, have not progressed as planned due to continued tightening of Chinese security in border areas. Intelligence reporting from all sources deals primarily with military, political, and construction activities along the Tibetan border with India, that is. The Tibetan paramilitary unit, a remnant of the 1959 resistance force, is dispersed in 15 camps, unquote, in northern India and Nepal, quote. The Tibetan leadership views this force as the paramilitary arm of the government in exile. Because of the diplomatic sensitivity occasioned by the presence of the Tibetan force in India, it's been enjoined from offensive action which might invite Chinese retaliation. Joint efforts to disperse the force to other uninhabited areas of India have not been successful because of Chinese reaction or of difficulties in resupply, unquote. Joint Indo-US teams, quote, responsible for radio contact with and operational direction of the radio teams, the paramilitary force, and the support mechanism, unquote, in India, quote, continue to serve their intended purpose with a minimum of problems. Bilateral CIA Tibetan intelligence collection operations into Tibet have increased significantly, both in number and value, during the past few years. Activities designed to develop a dynamic political program to weld the refugee communities into a cohesive whole under the leadership of the Dalai Lama and his brother Gyelo Tondop continue. These include the Geneva, New York, and New Delhi Tibet houses, unquote. These Tibet houses coordinated non-combat diplomatic operations, mostly overseas. Quote, the covert training program conducted in the United States, under which some 250 Tibetans were trained, ended in November 1964. 20 selected Tibetan junior officers studied at Cornell University over a 3-year period. This program was concluded in July 1967. CIA is considering a continuation of this program on a limited scale. The Tibetan Organizational Party, the Chokhasam, in parentheses, the defense of religion by the 3 regions, Kham, Amdo, and Uchang, established in India in April 1964 by Gyelo Tondop, now has an active press and publications arm. The Tibetans are making an effort to mold it into an effective organization aimed at developing a political consciousness and a political program with which to challenge the communist efforts inside Tibet. Fan programs. During 1967, I'm coming to the end now, the Dalai Lama began what is hoped will be a long-range program on projecting himself and Tibetan affairs on an international basis, unquote, via visits to Japan, Thailand, Ceylon, Burma, Cambodia, and several European countries. Quote, Gyelo Tondop, acting for the Tibetan Partnership in our liaison with the Indians, has proposed the establishment of a Tibetan Operations Center to represent Tibetan interests in India. This Tibetan Center would conceivably provide greater efficiency in the Tibetan handling of existing operations and in the relegation of operational tasks to Tibetan assets. Basic covert program to be implemented includes deployment of landline wiretap teams to selected priority targets within Tibet activation of special refugee debriefing teams, a census of some 70,000 Tibetan refugees spread throughout India and its neighboring countries, which may look at additional operational assets, and the resupply of arms and ammunition to the Mustang Force, unquote. That is the operation Nixon ended for his clandestine opening to China initiative. Washington now seems to have revived the political elements of this used and successful, or pretty successful template from the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmood. Thank you for giving us a historical overview of the Tibetan struggle for self-identity and rights. This clearly falls into the category of how minority rights are caught in the great power competition. Thank you for giving us that overview, Mahmood. Now we will proceed to the closing part of our this afternoon session. We have got two commentators who will be commenting on the presentation today. I'm not too sure whether we have time. I think we do have time, but if the commentators, feel free to pose any questions to the presenters if you have any. I ideally would like to have some kind of a conversation, but because of time constraint, we may not have it. So anyway, let's get it going with the commentators. Let's start with Dr. Rohit Karki. Dr. Rohit, the floor is yours. We can't hear you. We still cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry. I will try to be very brief in my comments. I mean, looking into all four presenters, I mean, it's quite difficult to comment on each and every kind of aspect. But basically, as the first commentator spoke, I mean, Isabella, she highlighted the crucial aspect, and it is very important in the Asia Pacific region. That minority groups, they face significant challenges due to inadequate national legislation and also protections. And we know, despite the region's cultural and ethnic diversity, many minorities, including indigenous people, ethnics, and the religious groups, the group faces or they encounter systemic discrimination and marginalization. And we have seen that it had occurred due to the lack of comprehensive legal framework and also a lack of effective enforcement mechanism, which has kind of sort of increased these issues, which requires the urgent need for the legislative reforms and also the stronger international cooperation to ensure the protection and the empowerment of minority communities across the Asia Pacific region. In our own work in DCAF, we believe that the security sector governance and the reform activities may include the review of existing security-related legislations and the policies that ensures the laws are not discriminatory, but also at the same time, the activity that include the training of the security providers on inclusivity and non-discrimination. Moving to the second speaker, just briefly on the Professor Powell, he highlighted the issue of multipolar world, where power and influence are distributed among multiple nations. And we have seen in the context of Asia Pacific region, it presents a very complex kind of landscape. Because if you look into the region's diverse political systems and also the varying level of economic development, it influenced the implementation and also the protection of the human rights issues. And we know, as there are rising powers in the region which try to assert their influence, there is going to be tension between the national sovereignty and also how the international human rights standards are being implemented. And on Dr. Malihava presentation, I mean, it was very important to hear the insight from the Xinjiang province and also the data, some of the data that she has provided. So it would be very important, as she has said, if we go into the region and try to validate some of those data, it provides us very further insights. I mean, evidence-based insight what's actually happening inside the Xinjiang. And lastly, on the Muhammad Ali, Professor Muhammad Ali comment, I don't want to go into the detailed comments, but what we have seen, the dynamics of the major power competition and also the minority issue have posed significant challenges for the host countries. For example, as highlighted by Professor Mahmood, the issue of Tibet has an implication for host countries, like if you look into the context of India and also Nepal. I mean, the major power rivalries often exacerbate existing ethnic and religious tension within this nation, because as external powers may support different factions to advance their strategic interests within these countries. So based on my own experience, is that the countries in the region must navigate this complex diplomatic relation while addressing the needs and the rights of the Tibetan minorities in particularly, but also balancing both the domestic and the international pressures. So just to conclude, I mean, listening to all the four speakers, it was quite an insightful insight to understand the challenges faced by the minority communities, both in terms of the challenges, the domestic legislation, but also how the major power rivalries could further undermines their rights, and they don't end up becoming a pawns in the geopolitical struggle. So we have to be careful that that their rights are duly protected. I would like to end there. Over to you, Professor Chang.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. Thank you for such a succinct and clear and to the point comments. Now I'd like to pass on to Dr. Hassan Daud, and hopefully by the end of it we have some time to get some response from some of the speakers. Dr. Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. I think Rohit has, explained us the entire rundown of the entire session. It was wonderful. It was a privilege to hear from these eminent speakers. So before I give my understanding of the whole account, I would ask few questions if you would allow, just two. One is from Professor Powell, and I think I believe the way that the world is turning, and we see elections happening across the globe with more than 60% countries going into elections. Professor, do you think the agendas that have been put, especially in our part of the world, Pakistan, India, and some of the other countries, and what is happening in Bangladesh as we speak, I think, do you fear more the world becoming increasingly unequal, unjust, and violent based on these political discussions that is growing and the brewing conflicts that are emerging?
Would you like to finish up all the three questions, and then I'll try to
And
moderate them?
my other question was from Malihaba, because I've been in Xinjiang, I've seen the progress happening there. So Malihaba, based on how the technology is transforming China, and how is it helping China grow both in the trade and economic front, but also on the political front. And I also believe that trade and technologies are two factors which help address poverty related issue, but also create conflicts. So do you see that with technology growing, AI, robotics coming in the mainstream of Chinese way of work, do you see regions within China being discriminated by any means? Because perhaps that would be next on agenda because the Western agenda in and around Xinjiang has been growing on issues, even on agriculture sector, we see. So would you highlight these are my two questions.
Is that all, Dr. Hassan, your questions? Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan. Professor Powell, would you like to respond to Dr. Hassan's question on the upcoming general elections?
Look, it is interesting that this year is a year of elections, and elections, of course, are moments in countries where almost anything can happen, particularly in places that are experiencing economic challenges, where people's lives are not where they'd hoped them to be, and where there are significant frustrations about the state of their own circumstances, as well as the state of the circumstances of their communities and countries. So it creates a general environment of considerable flux. The other thing that's happening at the moment is not only do we have these episodes, we also have deep underlying structural transformations in terms of the global economy and how global value flow of trade, of investment, and of people is re-articulating, particularly in the post-COVID environment. And the intersection, I guess, between dynamics, together with geopolitical concerns and the anxieties, and I'm going to steal or borrow a term from Dr. Mahmoud, who has described this in the past as the emergence of a displacement anxiety between the global primate or the hegemon, I think is causing a period of considerable instability. What happens out of this is hard to say. Having said that, I think there are some things which are relatively certain in terms of the momentum that exists, and that is the ongoing economic forces that are at play that have been reshaping the dynamics of global trade and global investment flows for at least 15 years. And those factors are going to, I guess, lay the foundations for how the political superstructure, if you will begin to play out its contests. My greatest concern, as I think my presentation kind of suggested, is that the aspirations of countries to pursue their own economic and social development in a way that amplifies the sovereignty of their own nations and their own cultures is continually at risk at the moment, and has been for many decades, of being dragged into the politics of great powers, but more particularly the politics of a hegemon that is clinging to the world of the past. And what behoves, I think, the countries of particularly the global majority is to find courage in their collaborations, to find the strength that comes from being in the 21st century, where there is a lot more global awareness of these issues than was the case in the last century, to hold the course, to pursue economic development and national security in a way that delivers ultimately peace and prosperity for their own countries. So, in short, we're going through a year of flux underpinned by economic dynamics, which I think are very, very locked into place, with a hegemon that is behaving like somebody who is experiencing deep grief at the moment. So difficult times, but I think we can see through that so long as we don't react in anger, but react with a focus on what matters.
Thank you so much, Professor Paul. Time is running out, but I want to get Mahmoud Ali in, and then I will close with Malihaba. Mahmoud, for those of us who are not familiar with displacement anxiety, 1 minute, explain it to us what it is. 1 minute. Unmute, please.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks very much to Professor Powell. He's been very kind to me over the many months now. I think I'd like to add one other phrase, if I may, which I call systemic transitional fluidity. And what Professor Powell has referred to sort of deals with the core of the system, if you like. But the system itself is altering the way what we have had for roughly, if you could say, from the beginning of the Vasco da Gama European era of navigation and exploration and colonization and imperial domination of the rest of the planet. That 500-year period of transatlantic domination is changing. It's not something we are alive and to, or we have not experienced this. This is so far a theoretical, a conceptual construct that we have had Western domination shape not only power structure and balances, but also the discourse. And all that is changing now. And systemic transitional fluidity brings uncertainty, anxiety, concern, fear. So external balancing, internal balancing, everybody hedging like mad, all actors trying to defend, advance, and protect their own interests. But things are very uncertain. They're fluid. That's why systemic, it's a difficult period. We got to really be very careful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud Ali. And now, Dr. Malehaba, all eyes is on Xinjiang right now. So we would like to listen to
Okay.
you by way of closing today's session. Go ahead, Dr. Malehaba.
Okay, and thank you, Dr. Hassanbat, for your question. And I understand your question as whether the technology development will create or lead to a kind of regional discrimination. So far, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that Xinjiang is within the 12 favorite destination for the migration in China within all the 31 provinces. So I think so far this is not the problem for Xinjiang. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, we will close our today's discussion. We've just 1 minute past the allocated time, so that's not too bad in terms of timekeeping. We are supposed to start the second session at 4:30, so we will have about 9 to 8 minutes break. I hope all of you can stay on for the second session, but if you cannot, doesn't matter. We hope to meet up again some other way, some other platform, and then we'll continue our conversation. I have to tell you, today's conversation has been very stimulating for me personally. It has just challenges some of my sort of conventional thinking on human rights, and I'm going to work on it. And hopefully, we will continue to work together to improve
Peter, can I
the minority rights.
make a short request that since you're recording these sessions and all the others, could you also share them through website or somewhere so that we can later,
Sure, I'll refer
Yeah.
that to Andy, Andy and the Global Governance Institution. The folks will make sure that it gets disseminated.
Yeah.
I'm sure, Dr.
Thank you.
Hassan. I'm sure they will send you the link that you could share with the rest.
Thank you.
Okay, now have a break and hope to see, if not all of you, most of you at 4:30. Take care now. Bye.
And that's my chance to
and you might want to mute it.
下一节是那个安娜来主持，你可以那个休息一下。
Friends and colleagues, let's have the second part of the Forum on Promotion and Protection of Minority Rights and United Nations SDGs. The forum again is being hosted by Geneva Center for Security Governance, the International Association of Human Rights and Social Development, East-West Bridge, and of course the Global Governance Institution, or which is co-hosting it at the forum here in Beijing. So to start with the second session, let me call on Mr. Chen Shi-chen, President of Global Governance Institution, to deliver the welcome remarks. By the way, my name is Ana Rosario Malinduguy. I'm the Vice President for, I forgot the institution that I'm representing at the moment. Asian Century Philippine Strategic Studies Institute, but I'm also a fellow of DGI. So, Mr. Captain Andy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anna, for your introduction, and also on behalf of the Global Government Institution, and also the host of the Beijing part of this forum, and also a very big in-person gathering of this forum. Let me first say, welcome to Beijing and welcome to DDI. And thank you very much to come for a very long way to this forum. And let me first introduce you this place. We call it Center for Inclusive Coexistence of Civilizations. So this concept actually built to the exact opposites of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. So that's the origin of the place of the name of this place. So that's why we invite speakers from different countries to exchange the civilization dialogue. And of course, minority rights is one part of the civilizations. And different countries have different problems. As a welcome guide, I just want to share with you. China actually has a large group of minorities. In addition to Uyghurs and Tibet regions, you are quite familiar with. We have more than 50 other minority groups. But we have our own institutions and law systems to govern the relations, to regulate relations among different minorities and majorities. And so far, I think we did quite well. We call it minority autonomous system. So let me give you some small points how we did it. For any autonomous region, minority autonomous region, the mayor, the president of that government must be from minority. But the secretary general, of the party system, will be from Han dynasty. So that's one part of the story, for our system. And then also there are many different regulations in terms of the education and the tax. So for all these minority regions, their tax do not have to be given to the central government, but for the Han population majorities. So the local council, they have to give a large portion of tax to the central government. But for the minority region, they do not have to do that. And also for the educational system, in particular for the college entrance examination. So for all the minorities, they are students, students from the minority region. Their entry points, the points of the entrance of the college are 20 or 10 points below the line of the high majority. So I just give you two examples to show that we have our own laws and systems to deal with, to guarantee the rights of the minorities. And but still, we have some problem because of the capacity building, language problem. But so far, I think the government did a very good job in guaranteeing the minority rights. And that being said, we all know that given the background of the great power competition, still the human rights in the minority region is always used as a political weapon to accuse China. So that's quite normal. That's quite we could see many in the coverage of the media. But still, because China is not good at telling its stories, at presenting itself. So the story I told you, about our law and our system, is seldom heard by people from the Western world. So that's also the reason we hold such kind of forums to share among different nations. their system, their laws, their practice in promoting and protecting the minority rights. And finally, as I also on behalf of President Cooking Tea and other co-hosts, we draft an initiative on the protection and promotion of our minority rights. And I think at the end of the day, we will disseminate this initiative to all the participants and the organizations you represent. So we hope that all the participants and members of and your affiliated organizations could be an understanding party to this initiative. And I think, in particular, at this stage, we can take with the background of the initiative, and also I will send you I have already sent you the text of the initiative. And I'd like to close by saying that actually, because English is not our native English, we are not good at telling stories. So for this forum, for the 2 sessions, we welcome all of your organizations to disseminate the content we have discussed, including the videos, presentations, and initiative. So without further ado, I'd like to give back the floor to Anna.
Thank you so much, Captain Andy. And it was a very nice welcome remarks. Basically, it also gave us a background of the minority autonomous system in China, and telling everyone also that if you really look at China, I think the minority is very much protected and being given priority. So with that, I would like to inform everyone that we have 5 speakers and 2 commentators. Each speakers will have 10 minutes. I will not be that strict, but I think you know your limits. And also 5 minutes for our commentators. So to start with, let me call on Dr. Hassan Butt, Associate Professor of Baria University and former Chairman, Provincial Board of Investment. Dr. Butt, are you ready? Yeah, he is online, but I think he's there. Yes, you have the floor.
Hassan, is yours. Floor is yours.
The floor is yours, Dr. Hassan. Yes, please. I don't see him. Yeah, he is Dr. Hassan. I think he is.
He's having some problem.
He was not able to speak.
I think it's because his internet.
Oh, could be.
Okay.
There he is. Okay, there he is.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I believe, I was part of the earlier session also, brilliant idea, especially around technology, around discrimination, around minorities. For me, I think the world is becoming increasingly unequal, unjust, and violent, with more conflicts coming up, even based on good political reasons. So what we've seen in Bangladesh, what we are seeing, and the brewing tensions between US and China, and how they are impacting the overall supply chain on. So from my standpoint, who works on technology and who works on investment attraction, especially in this part of the world, I think when I look at this year, especially where the world is going into elections, billions are voting, making perhaps this the largest election in the history, and the economic impact of that, and the slogans that are made, whether they are just, whether they are not just, I think is creating some more friction between have and have-nots. I see some of the political agendas being tailored around minorities and rights of minorities, and in few countries it is just the opposite. I also see that the vulnerable elements of societies are the minorities that are impacted by poverty to politics to armed conflicts based on religion and geography. And while we look at geography for leveraging this as a natural endowment, I think this is also becoming an increasingly riskier area. And also, trade and technology has always been a source of conflict, but now they're becoming increasingly vulnerable, especially for people from the elements of have and have nots. So, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand, because the kind of group that we've gathered here, I think all of us must understand that the foremost to the promotion of social stability is the right of just and equitable economic development. And this is not just for the developed world to give us, or maybe some policy or UN based agenda. I think this is basic human rights, to right to develop and to have new technologies and access to those technologies. So when minorities groups are afforded equal rights and protection, it helps prevent social unrest and conflicts that can arise from feelings of marginalization and discrimination. I think we need inclusive policies that ensure minorities to have access to education, employment, healthcare, that can actually help us build harmonious society. And we have very good case studies around us, and we see countries which are doing well on this. I think also, for in terms of tapping into the diverse talent perspective of all our countrymen and citizens, a country can stimulate innovation and economic growth, driving progress and for reducing poverty. For this, I believe, and I think I'll use this platform for putting up a request to the development, which can play a vital role in supporting minorities' right in our part of the world through diplomatic pressure, development of aid and trade and agreements and around these areas, and that can encourage governments to adopt and enforce policies that protect minorities groups. Because I would be carefully watching some of the political manifestos that are being put around there. And that would be, I think, my area of research for this year, because whether these high claims that the politicians make, would this create more divide or would this bring more harmonious societies? I also would like to see that in terms of the political discourse that we go into, what we see in the developing world is also sometimes disturbing for us. And this divide has to end. And I also believe that racism is influencing international policy making and, of course, perpetuating inequality. The handling of conflict suggests that some lives are deemed less valuable than the others. And what we see in Gaza alone, I think, is the highest number of casualties that have happened in this short period, is perhaps what we look to. And within the conflicts, there are sections and portions which are marginalized. And I also believe that China's Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Cultural Initiative, which is bringing people together, understanding each other's limitations and sort of creating that SWOT analysis. I think it emphasizes the importance of cultural exchanges, transcending mutual learning, and of course, reducing clashes, and perhaps this notion around clash of civilization being addressed through regions and countries coming together. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that when, as think tanks, as scholars, we work together, we should work and act perhaps swiftly with a human-centric approach and urge our politicians in all our respective countries and decision makers to embrace courageous, value-based decisions. This means considering not just their social class or corporate interests, but the global interests at stake. And I think what I've seen in Pakistan, the division between have and have-nots because of climate change, because of the recent floods, I think these are the areas where we all, as team, as scholars, have to work together for the well-being of the minorities. So I will end on this, but I think there's a lot to do, lot to work on, lot to research on, and perhaps we should get together more often on similar agendas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan, for that very enlightening short speech. And in that presentation of yours, I think one important thing that you have emphasized is that social equality can be addressed through economic development, and because this is a basic human rights. And part of it, I think, that plays a key role is technology and investment. And you also importantly highlighted that the world right now is facing a lot of challenges and conflict. And I think racism is very much embedded in all of this conflict that you have raised. And you've mentioned Gaza conflict. So thank you for that. And I hope that the next speaker also, let me call on the next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Harvey Carey Zoden, Deputy Chairman of HCD Earth Care Culture Association. Dr. Zoden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks very much. And Andy, thank you very much for organizing this and for the invitation. So in what seems like a coordinated attack to encircle China politically and economically, some Western nations, most especially mine, continue to attack China for alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang. Take as Exhibit A the US 2021 Uyghur Forced Labor Act. My thesis is that these countries are trying to divert attention from their own human rights violations, and that they have absolutely no right to do so under the long-standing equitable doctrine of clean hands until they eliminate their own numerous deficiencies first. In Western common law jurisprudence, the concept of clean hands is more than 3 centuries old. It was first referenced in an English legal treatise in 1728 that states that he that hath committed iniquity, that's gross injustice or wickedness, shall not have equity. But this doctrine has an even more ancient lineage. Some scholars find the origin in ancient Chinese customary law. Other scholars trace its roots to the Roman law that predates the early 6th century Justinian Code, one part of which codifies earlier Roman law. The clean hands doctrine also finds its origins in the Christian Bible's New Testament from roughly the same era in the Gospel according to John. As stated in the Bible, the King James Version says, "And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto Jesus a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said unto Jesus, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such people should be stoned to death. But what do you say?" And Jesus answered, "That he who is without sin, let them cast the first stone." This is precisely the doctrine of clean hands as we know it today. In fact, I find it to be a profound irony that some self-professed Christians, like the pseudo-expert Adrian Zenz of Germany, who only set foot in Xinjiang once as a tourist 2 decades ago, should falsely cast the first stone against China and the CPC. In doing so, he even violates the principles of my Jewish faith that we share in common with his Christian beliefs in the 10 Commandments, the 9th of which states, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." The reason for America's unclean hands is that white supremacy and racial discrimination are in America's DNA. and they predate the country's founding. Much of the early US economy was based on slave labor, and later, after a brutal 4-year civil war, a kind of slavery continued to exist under a different name, Jim Crow, in which Black people were kept down by lynchings by the Ku Klux Klan. Similar discriminatory US laws, biases, and racial hatreds exist to this very day, a quarter century into the 21st century. Consider that to maintain the system is why Republicans today are aggressively trying to cancel as many Blacks from voting as possible. This is evidenced by the state of Georgia's Senate Bill 202, signed into law in 2021 by a white governor surrounded by all white men, behind whom was a picture of the Callaway plantation on which Black slaves lived and died for generations. The law is a blatant attempt to block minorities from voting, and we can call it Jim Crow 2.0. And it's an ironic coincidence that the trial of the police murdered Black man, George Floyd, was in progress the day that that law was signed. The verdict against the policeman was by no means a certainty, given that the laws almost invariably favor the police in the United States, and they discriminate against minorities. Actually, some of our indigenous peoples, Native Americans, also called American Indians, were enslaved too. Others of our first peoples suffered serial genocides, a legal term. As a Jew and a lawyer, I don't use lightly, as some others in the West have misused it recently. Many early white Americans were fueled by the belief in American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, that they were chosen by God for a special mission to tame the land and the so-called savages who lived on it since time immemorial. In the name of God, Americans conducted serial genocides against our original inhabitants in a series of vicious wars. While slaves were unfairly fighting with bows and arrows against guns and other armaments, they also were no match against the force of American law and so-called justice. As championed by the Donald Trump of his era, slave owner President Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced removal of numerous Indian tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to what was designated as Indian Territory that was west of the Mississippi River. It's a kind of poetic justice that Jackson, who's been on the front of the ubiquitous $20 bill since 1928, is going to be replaced on it by a woman of color, former slave and pioneering civil rights leader Harriet Tubman, if Trump isn't reelected. The Indian Appropriations Act of 1851 established Indian reservations in the territory that would become Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Kansas. The federal government envisioned reservations as a method of keeping Native American tribes off desirable lands that white Americans coveted and wished to settle upon. Many Native American tribes resisted the reservation system, resulting in a series of more violent and bloody battles that led to the forced relocation of most Native Americans onto reservations. Propelled by American racism, it wasn't until 1924 that all Native Americans born in the US were recognized as citizens. For most, life on the reservation was and still remains, until today itself, challenging. Although Native Americans were allowed to form their own tribal councils and courts thus retaining a veneer of traditional governing structures, to this day, they continue to suffer disproportionately from poverty, from malnutrition, alcoholism, incarceration, and low living standards and rates of economic development. Native Americans and Blacks suffered disproportionately from the US COVID-19 debacle. Asian Americans, especially Chinese, have had painful parallel experiences. Escaping from the opening waves of the century of humiliation, Chinese immigrants, principally from South China, came mid-19th century to work the California gold rush and to build the transcontinental railway. This symbiotic relationship was short-lived. As a decade later, Asians were seen as a threat on multiple levels. The fear of a yellow peril led to Chinese women being prevented from immigrating to the US for decades by the Page Act of 1875, because it was presumed that they were all prostitutes. Chinese men were soon barred by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I guess that name dripping with racism says it all. And to add insult to injury, the Page Act was only repealed in 1974, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. But the bad news is that it was replaced by another act which allowed only about 100 Chinese to immigrate into America until 1965, when it too was repealed. Anti-Chinese racism continued, and against other Asians. In February 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which led to the abrupt ordering and forced relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the US West Coast to faraway military-run concentration camps. More than 2/3 of them were native-born American citizens. More recently, former and perhaps soon-to-be President Donald Trump scored cheap political shots as well as diverting attention from his gross incompetence of combating COVID, calling the disease the Kung flu, the Wuhan virus, the China virus, and so on. The result was a serious uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes, including murders. Why anti-Asian as opposed to anti-Chinese? Because Americans are so ignorant that most can't tell one Asian nation's face from another. As a result of Trump's leadership, Asian Americans who would have never considered gun ownership felt compelled to buy weapons from handguns to AR-15 assault rifles, and with good reason. There was nearly 150% increase in anti-Asian hate over the previous year, American hate crimes over 2019. As one Asian American leader put it, the political leadership under Trump really puts the target on the backs of people perceived to be Chinese. And racism has soiled the reputation of other of American allies who are also British colonies, neighboring Canada, far off Australia, for example. Both have too much in common with the US and each other when it comes to white supremacy and institutional racism. The list of shame extends, of course, to America's allies who are colonial powers themselves, such as England, France, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Want to talk about a true human rights leader? You only have to look at China, who unprecedentedly lifted 800 million of its people out of poverty. China, whose life expectancy at birth once was half that of the US, now has surpassed it. And China, a backward country when I first came here in 1988, is now helping all of us globally as a leader in clean, renewable energy. So let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zubin, for that very informative, very enlightening presentation. I really, I would like to highlight again that the concept of clean hands. It's something I think that most people in the West should learn, should think about and remember, precisely because this talks about the hypocrisy some Western countries, especially the United States, saying like, there are a lot of minority violations in China. But if you really look at the United States, it's facing a lot of racial, human rights issue. And one of that, I think, is racism, which is very much evident. And you perfectly trace it back from the time of the colonization of the American Indians up to the COVID-19, which actually there were a lot of hate crimes against Asian people. So thank you so much for that. But on the other hand, you also put a brighter side of your presentation by highlighting that China is an example of a country that was able and is able to uplift many people from poverty. And thank you so much for that kind of highlight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I call on our next speaker, let me, I think it's good for me to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Dennis Stanton, Beijing Bureau Chief of the Irish Times. Thank you for coming and for being part of this forum. And also Mr. Kumada Nauku, lecturer at School of International, a doctor. Yeah, he is already. Sorry. Dr. Kumada Nauku, lecturer at the School of International Studies at, how do you pronounce this? Zhejiang University. Zhejiang. My Chinese is not that good these days. Zhejiang University. Thank you, ma'am, for coming, and also Dennis for being here. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, let me call on Ms. Alta Diviati, Secretary General of Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Anna. I should also say that apart from being the Secretary General of Malaysian Human Rights Institute, I'm also a fellow at Iman Research, a co-founder as well, and that's how actually I met Andy and Mr. Captain Andy Tian, and who invited me to be here today. So thank you. Hearing everybody's presentation has definitely been very enlightening, and it's good to hear different angles on this topic, promotion, protection of minority rights and UN SDGs. So from my presentation, perhaps what I would like to do is maybe deep dive into the challenges on weathering human rights and minority rights within the Malaysian context, and to share a little bit of our experiences over the years. I mean, maybe to start off, I think what the key big international document that you have on your minority rights from the UN is the UN Minorities Declaration, which basically stresses the promotion and protection of rights of persons belonging to a national, ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority, so that they can contribute to the political and social stability of a country. It also should be noted in a way that there is no real internationally agreed definition. I guess the only one that I could trace was the UNHCR definition on what is a minority, and according to UNHCR, and minority is an ethnic, religious, or linguistic or cultural group, which is fewer than the number of the rest of the population. So within that, what we have, if you look at Malaysia, so perhaps just to bring everybody together on the landscape of Malaysian demographic. I mean, Malaysia is a very young country. We only came to an existence post-colonialism in 1957. So you're looking at a population that is very multicultural, where the definition of majority and minority in actual fact is very, very slim. Why do I say this? Because, for instance, the Bumiputra, which is what is defined as the sons of the soil, consisting of a number of groups, and some of them also are more minority than others, make up 64%. And this is what you say majority. But you break it down further. The political power is being predominantly controlled by the Malay community, and they are predominantly Muslim, and they only make up about 55% of the population. 45% of the population are non-Malay, non-Muslims, and they're considered minority, but yet you're only very small, 10% difference. And within that, you could break it down even further, but that part of the Bumiputra group is also the natives of Sabah and Sarawak. In terms of population, they're much smaller, but maybe about 4 to 5 million. But within the political agreement of the country, in particular, the Malaysian Agreement of 1963, of the creation of Malaysia, they are probably technically, politically, as equal as the Malay majority that is predominantly in Peninsular Malaysia. So just to show the complexity of it. So then the discourse is who's really a minority, who's not. But then you should also probably bring it bigger, deeper, minority and vulnerable. Who are vulnerable communities that are at risk of being deprived politically, socially, economically. And this has always been since the day of Malaysia's creation in 1963. I have to correct that. Malaya independence is 57, but Malaysia, the Federation of Malaysia, only came into existence in 1963. And since that, I think we've been evolving a lot in terms of our demographic into what it is today, highly multicultural, multi-ethnic. And one of the key, more recent challenges we are having is the acceptance of refugees, asylum seekers within the country. If you're looking at official numbers, official numbers under UNHCR, there's only about 200,000 refugees. But unofficial numbers is nearly 500,000. And if you look in Sabah and Sarawak, the Borneo Islands, stateless refugees, I mean, there's only 1.6% of the whole population of Sabah, but it's the equivalent of the same number for those who are undocumented, stateless, and illegal migrants. So within that context, Malaysian government just lumps up everyone into illegal migrants. So then there's a challenge, since we are not party to the human rights, to the Refugee Convention, and we lump everybody who doesn't come with documents into illegal migrants, then this whole category becomes even more deprived. And how do we move from there? So that's basically, but at the same time, what I need to stress is also that within this very complex relationship, Malaysia economically and socially has been thriving for the past, since independence. We don't exactly have, apart from the May 13th racial riots that were very much focused on geographical areas, we have been able to move forward and figure out a social contract within all these groups. And how do we do that? I mean, that's a whole discussion on its own. So human rights. So Malaysia only came to officially, I think with the creation of the Malaysian Human Rights Commission in 1999, it was where the government basically announced its support for the universality of human rights, because all the National Human Rights Institute, that's what we hold on as the key guidance when it comes to defining what is human rights. But has this been a very, this year is 25 years since Malaysia has established its Human Rights Commission, but how has that journey been? Has it been an easy, or is it been something that we all come to agree on? I think we cannot deny the fact that the discourse between the universality of human rights and the culturalism of it is a continuing thing. While at the same time, Malaysia announces that it believes in universality, yet in our system, we also have dual systems, the Sharia legal system, and we also have the civil legal system for family law, for instance, and trying to find that ability to coexist is a challenge, but it has been able to move. And I think one of the key things is also realizing that human rights is evolutionary. It does move. Nothing is static. Even culture is not static. And the realization also that there is the generations of human rights. It's not just holding on to the political civil liberties, but looking at social, economic, and cultural rights. as a key element of Malaysia's policy in pushing the well-being of the whole country, where within that, albeit there has been issues, for instance, unequal or discriminative policies on race-based affirmative action, for instance, that prioritizes the Bumiputra over other ethnic groups. Institutional racism that's as a result of that. These things are still ongoing and is still being debated, and we still haven't come to an agreement as a whole country whether we want to go away with race-based affirmative action or not. But at one side, we're still continuing to have this discourse. For instance, there's this huge debate continuously for the past 10 years. There is one university in Malaysia that is called the University Institute of Technology Malaysia that was set up as an education institute for Bumiputra only. At that time, the Bumiputras were very much disadvantaged, but it's been 30 years. So the question whether it should maintain its ethnic-based policy is something that is continuously being challenged again and again. And eventually, I think the country will come to some form of agreement. But this discussion cannot necessarily just be top-down. It also has to be bottom-up, for instance. Another aspect where I think cultural relativism and human rights also is another challenge is the duality of the legal system, the Sharia legal system and the civil legal system. For instance, capital punishment. In Suhakams, in my organization's discussions in engaging in trying to remove capital punishment, it has been easier to have discussions with the Islamic thought system than the civil thought system, for instance, which initially we thought would be the other way around. But at the same time, we're having trouble we're still having difficulties in trying to outlaw child marriage within the Islamic context, but we have done it with the civil. So this is definitely an ongoing process, but I think the key part of it is to acknowledge that there is cultural relativism. We cannot just go and try to find a moderate path between two very extreme views. And I think then there is a way to be able to not only make a policy change, but for that policy to be accepted by the people and the public. And just to maybe round up, the incidents that's been happening, particularly the genocide in Gaza, has without a doubt, I mean, we all know, has significantly impacted people, and Malaysia is of course not an exception. And I think we've always been very vocal in our support of Palestine rights. But one of the things that I think is new regarding this discourse, and I think this is very positive, is that the way human rights discussion for a long, I mean, even as recent as a year ago, this whole discourse of human rights versus more localized Malaysian rights or human rights in Malay, it was called acuan tempatan, designed locally, which had created an uproar saying, what does that mean? Does that mean one person's life is more than the other or so forth? Because it's just a term. But I think one of the things that's came out from the issue of the Middle East is the discussion within Malaysians, within the more staunch Islamic groups, the need for human rights to be a bit more universal. Because I think the realization that with not having it, you're so vulnerable. And then also, this is again engagement of those that come to the organizations to talk to my organization to talk about it. Is also talking about international law. For a long time, nobody's been bothered by international law. But now suddenly saying, we do need for it, or else we can end up like Gaza. So this is one of the, I think, good things that one of the small silver linings that I'm seeing locally is wanting to have more ownership over human rights being from a global south. The fact that everything is controlled by the North makes them define it. And suddenly when things go against it, well, what's happening now, and the silence is so deafening, is there is more need for the global south to take ownership, not to change, but to own it and also push for its implementation, and not allow that implementation and that ownership to be so one-sided. And I think that's one of the interesting things that's coming up. And I think that's one of the things that we need to exploit further and push for it, is taking more ownership from the global south. Thank you. I'm open to questions.
Yeah, I think later
Yeah.
I have questions actually. I mean, like, thank you so much for the very, I think my impression of your presentation as the moderator is like, I'm trying to, it seems like I said, oh, we have a lot of challenges in terms of minority rights and human rights in the Philippines, but it seems like Malaysian context is very complex. I mean, you know, complex in the sense that, you know, issues related to human rights, minority as against the majority right, and how you even distinguish between a minority and a majority is very much challenged in that sense, in that context of yours, which is very important for us to know, especially in my country, because we're part of Southeast Asia, Philippines, and I also work in different countries in Southeast Asia. So I think the good thing in your presentation is you highlight that in a multiracial, very multiracial and multicultural society like Malaysia, this kind of issues exist. And I think one important highlight in your presentation is the last words that you have said. The Global South has to have ownership when you talk about this issue and has to push it. And I think I will add to that it should not be hijacked by the few Western countries that actually sometimes in many ways define the frame of what is human rights, which is not suited usually in the context of the global south. I think that is a very, very good presentation. Thank you so much for that. And without further ado, let me proceed to the last but not the least speaker for this second forum of our this afternoon. And ladies and gentlemen, may I call on Mr. Jan Pak, Senior Fellow, Belt and Road Focus for Asia Pacific. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think we're at the risk of one too many Malaysians here. Myself following Alta. The Malaysia situation is indeed interesting and instructive, but to build on and to use the rich material laid out by previous speakers, I'm going to draw on what you guys said and try to pull together some of the, I think, conceptual puzzles I still have about the concept of minority rights. It's used so much, you know, it's a UN term, for example, that we don't stand back and sometimes ask, why are we using this particular phrase? And this is to also refer a little bit to go back to a little bit of what Anna was saying about developing our own concepts. And before you do that, you might want to actually question the concepts that you're using and try to articulate a little bit the framework that they occur in. Minority right, the concept of minority is of course, it's flatly an arithmetic statistical.
Yes.
One wonders what kinds of moral and legal claims mere minority elicits. Why should anyone deserve any extra rights because one is a minority? What kinds of rights are these that pertain to minorities but not to individuals? So there again, you have the concept of that a whole other set of issues arises about this, whether there are such things as group rights, community rights, separate from individual rights. But notice that the way I just posed the question is in a language that we all, many, I think almost all of us, very familiar with and grew up in, which is a liberal framework. a liberal legal framework of concepts, in which rights actually classically pertain to individuals. Group rights are a little bit strange and quite difficult to understand, except if you have a little history. For example, that one understands that in England, for example, church, the established church, because it's a state church, has certain rights. A certain community has certain rights, but they are not necessarily for protection. Now, we assume that minorities need protection. Why? From whom? Well, from the majority. In what context do minorities need protection from majority? Often in these democratic populist situations in which your vote, your demography, and your numbers then amount to greater power. And of course, this is a reasonable, very reasonable assumption to make. Then the minority needs to be protected from that. But I think, as Alta pointed out earlier as well, minority is not necessarily the most vulnerable. It doesn't equal disadvantage. In Malaysia, for example, although being in a minority, of course, is prima facie against a larger group, and in a political situation where electoral numbers count, etc., or just sheer numbers in a gang, you just have fewer and you're just less powerful. But there are such things as economic dominance, the issue which arose in early post-colonial Malaysia, where the Chinese is supposed to be sort of numerically smaller, not by very much, but economically extremely dominant. This is a feature of Southeast Asian history or society. But that question alone, one needs to stand back a little bit from it. How did this become a problem? How does one community get described, delineated, identified as an ethnic group or a race? How did I become, in particular, sort of the Chinese in Malaysia, as opposed to Hakka, for example? Some guy, descendants from South China, right? In Malaysia, you have different Chinese groups with languages, with Chinese so-called dialects, so different from one another. They don't understand each other, actually. In Europe, they would qualify as different languages. Similarly, with the so-called Malay or majority, you have people from Sulawesi, you have people from Java, who might not even have spoken the same language at home. So then the definition, the creation of minorities, is a feature of two great historical or two large sets of phenomena. It's an intersection of these, which we have to look at really to understand how this term is mobilized. One of these, quite clearly, is the nation state as a project. Now, in Southeast Asia, you see this with great clarity because every one of these nation states, right, is, well, Thailand and Siam by default. We have all of the others. It's the only one not colonized, but like China, pretty well humiliated, or pretty well hemmed in. But every one of these others is created by, is a product of its borders, its delineations, and its definition of who is what. What is a race defined by colonial masters? So you have that situation. This is important to understand because you then have, after decolonization, after independence, you have specified minorities, for example, identified with certain occupations, living in certain areas in a very familiar, particularly in British areas. You have this sort of Star Wars world of different creatures doing different things. The Irish are very familiar with this sort of thing. Or you have Irishmen there, and they have a particular function, like sub-function within the sort of white rule. Now, so you have that kind of racial hierarchy and construct and specialization task. Minority gets defined in those terms. But if you notice from Harvey's presentation, the operative issue there wasn't whether one was minority or majority. It's really ethnicity or race projected and as a construct. Native Americans were not, definitely not minorities on their own continent. They were created as a minority through elimination, right? They were defined in a particular way through elimination. So, Black people, in some areas, in some states at certain times, constituted majorities, more slaves than slave owners. Okay, so it's not conceptually not terribly useful there. The operative thing is race. What else does the concept of minority leave out? Well, it leaves out class, for example, something that taught not to outside of places like China. Perhaps even so, after 1991, I hope it's back, but you don't talk about it, particularly in a society that's actually relatively class-free. But you're taught not to talk about class. So many things are I talked about big frames. There's another big one, of course, deeply related to this, and I couldn't help talking about it already. That's colonial history, which of course did not end. Post-independence, the great era of independent states in the Declaration of Independence in Southeast Asia and Africa, for example, was post-war, 40s, 60s, so on. And there, after that, you didn't see an end to the racial politics. You certainly didn't see, you had a kind of Cold War, US hegemonic management of the ethnicities of other people. In some cases, these are minorities, in some cases, not. But this is where you see this phenomenon of Xinjiang, right, and Xinjiang, Tibet, laid up. Now, and so you might want to say this is the issue of minorities, but it's not terribly helpful. These are groups, these are identifiable cultural groups or even national groups, people with a history, language, distinctiveness. Okay, you can use the UN definitions to try to get at the concept of minority. But really the issue there is this divide and rule and this continuing incitement, this continuing stirring of racial hatred. And this is, again, the colonial notion of race here, which is really important. It did not go away in Southeast Asia with the Chinese minority, with the overseas Chinese minority. It was a huge feature of the Cold War. You cannot understand that indeed, the Americans may have lost in Vietnam, but they sort of won the Cold War. In Indonesia, through the extermination of the entire Indonesian Communist Party, right, through genocide, literally. But there was a racial component in which about Chinese were eliminated. You had that again in 1997 with the attack, Grom-type style attacks on Chinese people identified as Chinese. So this sort of incitement and by the way, these are not empty sort of accusations. This is well-established U.S. involvement, U.S. and British involvement in 1965, and the whole ethnic issue in Southeast Asia is extremely complicated, but it doesn't go away when there's a Cold War context. The worrying thing today is that we have a return. We'll talk about the return of the Second Cold War, but all these polities are ripe for this sort of thing because they're constructed out of people being called you a Malay, you a Burmese, and so on. By the way, Myanmar, just like Malaysia, very similar. You had, society, the kind of plural society, it's Bernard called it, right? My wife, Myanmar scholar, but created out of this management of races and ethnicities. So there's that vulnerability there. Where does this leave us? Sure. Where does this leave us? What does this say about how we should talk about it? By the way, I can't, as we're in the middle of this, I want to talk, about this demographic thing. Isn't it interesting that in Palestine, it's not about a minority, it's about the prevention of a majority. You're talking about an equality almost, right, between Jews and Palestinians. you want to prevent, and therefore you have to ethnically cleanse, quite frankly, or worse, much worse, as you know. So there again, minority rights is not useful. It completely drops out the question, the history of the conflict, etc. So while it's a useful concept, it's all the more useful if we understand where it comes from and how we address it. Where does it come from? It comes from a liberal framework. Until quite recently, I don't think we talked about minorities. We talked about the races, the ethnicities, or whatnot. We have this minority state. And by the way in which minority rights get articulated, talked about in the US, are often not about these cultural linguistic groups. They're about sexual minorities. This is not not the thing that springs to mind in Malaysia, but as a kind of group with communal cultural rights. But that's how it's spoken of. And there again, of course, we subdivide people into 36 genders as we do in New York or whatever. So, but these divide people. There's a dialectic between identifying a group and wanting to protect and honor what they have culturally within a larger community. There's a dialectic between that. You have to want to do that. You also want to have a greater society. So there's a balance. It's an unending type of balance that must be held. China is a wonderful example of this in the way it treats minorities and provides for autonomy. I think it's a system that has some of it is from the Soviet influence, because they too, the USSR, managed national groups like this. The danger of this is that you ossify the groups, that again, we're all aware here that these identities can shift, and you are not just this race, you are not just Chinese or Uyghur or whatever. You have many identifications, and by making it over politicizing it, you then freeze these things. And by applying the liberal framework of rights, I think it's overly limited. One needs to protect them, but I think rights alone are not enough. In fact, they put it in a kind of, they put the issue in a adversarial or court type process, in which actually it's illusory. The courts aren't going to protect you actually in that long time. How else can we think about it? We have to think about in terms of maintaining common good. A framework that I like is a common good framework, which is more classically Western, but also classically Chinese. In that you look at the benefit of the society, you understand that there are different groups, but you don't have to essentialize these particular associations, because we all inhabit a rich set of minorities, and I don't even want to say identities, but cultures. And you want to be able to move between them and to work them without getting involved in the sort of identity politics, which then fracture people, and you end up in these eternal conflicts between these groups, which is what you observe in Western Europe, in the North Atlantic style liberal democracies.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, it was a very, very mind-motivating kind of presentation. But one thing that I enjoyed it a lot, the presentation of John, and how he actually dissected actually the concept of minority rights being as framed in a liberal context or a liberal frame, and that was very good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think I agree with you. The concept of minority rights based on statistical and numerical thing is very limiting in many ways. And also the concept of minority rights as the way it's framed in a liberal sense is also in most cases does not apply to the different contexts in many countries in Asia. It does not really. And that's even a problem. I've studied human rights and been trained in that area as well. And sometimes I always have questions. Why is it that this kind of concepts are being imposed on people like me that I'm not I'm part of Asia. And I sometimes have that struggle because as far as I'm concerned, I was brought in an Asian culture by which the concept of community comes in and is very much important. When you say community, it includes almost everyone. And the greater good for the community is always being emphasized. I think that's one of the very important thing that you also brought out in your presentation. And thank you for that. So, but you know, we're done with the 5 speakers and we have 2 commentators. So let me call on our first commentator, Dr. Chen Pala, Vice Chairman of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Anna. After listening to 4 presenters, I learned a lot, and I have to say that I'm not that skilled in the human rights or sociologist, but I can contribute that I can see this issue that I've discussed. One is economic development, but not inclusive. Take the one presenter. And the second one, Dr. Presented, is a kind of theory in one side, but look at the challenge that China tried to reduce the poverty by promoting economic growth. And also, I think that the human right is the right people that need to live, can access to food, can access to water and other things. But without a good policy that policy include everybody that can get benefit from the economic growth. So the problem is most policies were framed by majority. Yes, and John just said, we may not have defined minority exactly. As policy framed by a majority, then leave the minority vulnerable to development. In that sense, I think all of us here should look at how create a policy that promote economic growth, not just growth, but sustainable growth, and at the same time inclusive, that may benefit to minority who cannot join the decision making. I have heard from Mr. Andy Chen that in China, in the community, if you are not that minority, you may not be lead that. I think that is one of the encouragement that promote minority group come into a leader or even making decision for their own. I think from that we need to think more inclusive policy from my listening to presentation, and to make sure the policy that may affect both majority and minority. Thank you. That's my sort of comment.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Pala. I think the most important, the highlight of your comment is more on developing inclusive policies that would protect and to a certain extent address the basic needs of people who are okay, so thank you so much for that. The next commentator is not present here or even in the Zoom, but I think he kind of sent a video of his comments, and his name is Eric Solheim, Vice President of Europe Asia Center, former Under Secretary of the United Nations. So yes, Captain Andy.
This is true. Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be asked to address the forum on promotion and protection of minority rights. This is truly an important issue. Look, nearly all nations in the world are multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and all nations have a divergence of political views, and there are minorities, sexual, when it comes to handicaps, and in many other ways. So promotion and protection of minority rights is one of the most central issues of our time. So I'm so pleased that you put this front and center in this conference in Kuala Lumpur and other places. The UN has made a number of resolutions, of course, about everything, the Convention of Human Rights from the early days of the United Nations, but many other conventions and decisions on this issue. That's a very good platform for the discussion. And I'd like to add that the Global South has a particular contribution to these issues. In many areas, the Global South is leading. Look, the first nation in the world who got an indigenous leader was Bolivia in South America, in Evo Morales. India, a couple of years back, elected a president who comes from the scheduled caste and from the indigenous people of the state of Odisha. And Bolivia and India are just two examples of developing nations taking the lead in getting the relationship between minorities and the majority population right in so many nations. Allow me to make 3 comments to this discussion. First, let's see this as an enormous opportunity, not a problem. It's true, of course, that there can be conflicts related to minorities and conflicts related to the relationship between minorities and majorities in many nations. But overall, this is an enormous opportunity for a richer cultural discourse in the world and for richer human exchanges. If we are different, if we are diverse, well, we can communicate, we can come together, and we can learn from each other. If we're all the same, well, there will be very little learning. Learning comes from the fact that we have different religions, different culture, different languages, different sexual orientation, and in so many other ways are different. Differences are no threat to humanity, and it's an enormous source of inspiration and an opportunity to get a better planet if we work together. Secondly, let's stop blaming each other. Sometimes you see people blaming other nations for their way of handling this issue. The issue of minority rights, promotion and protection of minorities is a global issue. I'm not aware of any nation in the world that's got it perfect. We're all struggling, we're all students, we all want to learn. Let's work together to find the right solutions. And if we want to work together, we need to foster a spirit of dialogue. That's of course the idea with this conference, but I really want this idea to be promoted in the years to come. Let us not politicize the issue, but see it as an issue where we can learn from each other and find the right solutions together. And finally, let's be practical. And let me give you a couple of examples from the field where I'm most engaged, environment, as to how we can advance from this issue. In Brazil, the issue of how to protect the rainforest is very central. The current Brazilian government has understood very well that a core to solve the issue of the protection of rainforest is to mobilize the indigenous communities. There are Native Americans in all the forests of Brazil. They know the place, they are close to the nature, and they can be the first line protectors of the forest if they are mobilized and if they are armed to do it. The indigenous group cannot fight the army, not fight the state. They are not powerful enough to do that, but they can win if they work with the state and if they're empowered by the state to protect the rainforest. The indigenous group are out in the forest and know everything which is happening. They can act very fast if they are given the power to act. Now, the very similar issue is the enormous opportunities which we now have in solar and wind farms in the world. But look, modern solar farms and wind farms are not small and cute. I just visited the biggest solar farm in the world near Urumqi in Xinjiang in China. That one farm is 4 gigawatt. That's more than the entire energy net, the entire grid of Nigeria, the biggest nation in Africa, just in one farm in China. So of course it's enormous. But that brings to the core the issue that you need to get the consent of the local people. Sometimes the local people are from majority populations, but very often local people in deserts or faraway parts of the world are from indigenous groups or from minorities. You cannot tell them how to act, but you need to work with them to find the right solutions. And of course, some of the profit, some of the value from the green revolution will have to remain with the local communities. So if we see the relationship to minority groups and the protection and promotion of them as an enormous asset in the green revolution of the world, we will succeed. If we try to do the green revolution without acting with the people, we will fail. I wish you a complete success with this most important meeting, and I'm looking forward to getting to know more about the results, because I think it will be a huge contribution to the global discourse on minority rights. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you as well. Happy Andy, do we open the floor for a little of discussion and question? I think it's okay. And I think there was a lot of very good, I mean, all presentations, even comments were really good. And I think we can open the floor for question and further discussion. So anyone who wants to, to throw out the first question.
I think we can invite our observers.
And also, of course, from people on Zoom, they can ask questions if they have some questions. Anyone who can, do you have a question?
I suppose one of the questions is something that Altaf raised, which was, in a sense, how we are responding to what's happening in Gaza. And so on the one hand, it's clear that one response is that it kind of highlights a certain double standard or hypocrisy. There's also, as you were saying, this whole question that it reminds people of their vulnerability if they don't have universal rights which can be enforceable. And I'm just wondering, when you're having these discussions about for example, what you were saying, Anna, about the idea that some of these, liberal norms are not appropriate for certain cases. I suppose what I'm wondering is, where do we stand on the idea of these universal? How important is it that they should be used?
I also have the same question.
I want to address that.
Yeah. I mean, just to add to the question, it's like, how far would we go? I mean, and at the same time, how can you possibly, push for universality of human rights and even the concept of minority rights, when in fact, as pointed by John earlier, there's a lot of questions, and even he dissected it, and it's very clear. I mean, the way it is conceptualized in the liberal framework, there's so many issues in there. And you cannot just tell like this group just because of the number they're minority. Not necessarily, because maybe they're minority, but they're not deprived, or they're not even marginalized. I mean, they're not deprived, or even they're not suffering from any human rights violation at all. Because that doesn't mean that in one context that you're a minority, automatically you are deprived. It does not mean like that in some context. So it's really a challenging concept, and yes.
I'm not exactly sure I can answer that, but in the discussion did open and particularly after the incident in Ghana, and these are with organizations that are considered more conservative. Yeah. And I think one of the key things that ended up coming up is the need for people to be allowed to live with dignity. And I think defining the term dignity is the key. So it's not looking at how special you are or how what, but at the end of it, I think everybody wants to live with dignity. And have basic and your basic needs protected, and that was something that we could come to an agreement with. So, I think one of the things which this situation allows is, I think the narrative, the dialogue has always been dominated by one section, and the type of language used has always been one-sided. But the issue is something that is experienced by everyone, and I think to allow the other groups to also share their narrative and use language that we can come to an agreement with is very critical. So, and I think for a long time, it's always been felt as imposed instead of you being part of that dialogue. And so this is why the discussion of to be part of promoting, not just promoting, to be part of defining, implementing human rights is critical for all segments of society. And for a long time, it's always just been it felt like it was really one-sided. And I think this is where I see the opportunity. Because I think one thing we can agree with, we all do want to live with dignity. Of course.
Exactly. And I think John can answer this, but I think one thing many of us not in the West feel uncomfortable about human rights is that it has been weaponized so much and used against us.
Exactly.
You said politely one party, but it's basically imperialist, weapon. And then in China, countries like China is the target. China is often targeted. China's human rights record, so it's weaponized. But is there any human rights violation in China that's so outrageous and we don't see anything? So it's that kind of thing. So there's human rights and then human rights. It's two separate things: the weaponized human rights and then the human rights that you are talking about that we should value.
But what I'm trying to say is, I think, at least in the Malaysian context, in my work, is that what's happened because of Gaza has allowed for segments of Malaysians that before this didn't even want to talk about human rights are now saying, no, we have to own it. We've got to take ownership from it, because if we don't, we're going to become victims of it.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's actually quite critical.
That's also part of imperial framework where we want to own things and we want to be able to discuss in our own language. But first, we have to use the human rights language or concept like sovereignty, which is a Western concept, against.
I experienced that.
Get it. Yeah. So first we do that, we have to push back by saying, this is our right, and then create our own discussion and our own concepts. And I think I want to thank Captain Andy for holding this, offering us this space to discuss this issue, because usually, I live in the West and I can't talk like this because the audience and then the people who are hosting are largely, so I think China hosting this is like owning the issue, taking the issue in our own hands. So I really appreciate, someone with clean hands hosting this.
You're just a bad person if you doubt rights.
That's how it is.
Yeah, John, please.
I think, Israel is described as time and again is the only democracy in the US. That is that a system in which you have elections, be governed by rules of law, with rights. Palestinians are dying of human rights. They're dying of their human rights. They've got so much human rights, they're being torn apart, starved, eliminated. Their children are being blown up. What I'm saying is that those rights don't do squat in a certain context. And it's not just a context of, oh, it's because of overwhelming power. And no, a clean exception can be made. These are terrorists. Ergo, no rights. Right? There are all kinds of ways. Today terrorists, yesterday another word. So today the word is just terrorist, for example, or you just say Israel has the right to defend itself. That's it. End of conversation. I'm not saying that the liberal framework, liberal universalism, is not an attempt, and often strategically for ourselves, the only way to articulate that universal concern in life. But Anglo-liberals have this curious habit of speaking as if they invented universality. It's as if Chinese people didn't have a notion of the cosmos, didn't have a tianxia, a world, and all under heaven. It's as if Buddhists didn't have a world, a cosmos. Almost every culture has a notion of the world and of all humanity. If you look at the terms that people have for themselves, they think of themselves as the human. That's their word for themselves, which you then particularize. So universalism comes with the territory of being human, actually. The issue here isn't the lack of that. The issue is the dominance, the hegemony of one to the exclusion of all others. In a multipolar world, you would have multipolar means of articulating universality, universal concern for human beings. Quite frankly, Western people didn't talk about their human rights before the Irish Constitution of the 40s. Its invention as a legal term came about through some debate. It comes about from the Catholic Church. The Irish Constitution put it in place. And it was strategic and it was useful. The church at first was against it for reasons that we don't have to go into now, but for good reasons. Because they had quite briefly, they had a richer conception of the protection of human beings. Because before this, if you tortured a child or you killed a child for no reason, you weren't violating the child's human rights. You were evil. You were doing something totally offensive to God. You were, even in Chinese terms, right? You were offending heaven. There were all kinds of ways of securing, one might say, the dignity of the human, the non-negotiability of human life. Cultures have different ways of doing this, but this particular legal way comes in and says, all your other ways of doing this, if you talk about something else, you're a bad person, frankly, you're so anti-democratic, you're against rights. What did we do? What did Europeans do before they had human rights? Okay, they had the laws of God, they had the 10 Commandments, they had prohibitions, absolute prohibitions against the killing of innocents. Those might actually have been more useful, might have actually had more normative claim than a legal regime which can be just upended like that rhetorically by saying, okay, these are terrorists. So there's a way in which liberal discourse is tied up with hegemony, with, frankly, a liberal order that is deeply, deeply dishonest and has run out of steam and is totally undiscredited, even if I wanted to, whether out of conviction or strategically to maintain, to prop that up, it's dead. Please don't come and talk to me about human rights anymore, because the things that you have done, right? I can't, please. And you are prevailing on you're asking me to pretend I'm stupider than I actually am. You're asking me to insult myself, to take you seriously. Just don't make me go through this shit. So that's the situation we're in. So let us all try to, it's a huge task try to articulate these concerns, these human concerns, which in each culture, that's why I talk about, it's important to talk about zone of civilization, which in each culture have been articulated in particular ways that are valuable, that are really quite rich. It's not just a framework that you can just upend like that by saying, oh, this terrorism.
And there's roots to it, yeah.
There are roots to it, there are practices to it, there are relationships to it, there are communities associated with it. Like it's in China, for example, it's tied in with your relationship with your parents, with your ancestors. So these are embedded and these are rich. But somehow we have lost that, and all we have is now to talk about minority rights, which is fine and good. I'm not against it. In particular, we need to defend the rights. We need to protect a particular community that really has a hard time and doesn't get a lot of shit is Aboriginal communities.
Yes.
Southeast Asia, for example, right? Yeah. So yeah, indigenous peoples, quote unquote. But even that term is not very helpful, right? Who are the indigenous people of China? Actually Chinese people. Sorry.
And I have a small point to make. Is that possible?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is Dr. Hassan. So I think in our discussion today and wherever we hear discussion around minority rights, sometimes it's mostly it's political driven with perhaps an economic agenda also. For countries like Pakistan, I'm not too sure about Malaysia and the other, and I sometimes feel that China is very lucky to be a very socialist country, because in our part of the world, sometimes religion, which is supposed to be a bridging factor, becomes a dividing factor, and sometimes within your own country, just being part of a certain sect or religion within the community of religion, a small sect makes you feel like a minority. And sometimes in this time and age where we would like to say that might is not right, but almost might is becoming right, and perhaps people with and it's easier for you to come on the street and raise slogans, and sometimes the right and the voice of the minorities die because of the noise that we create and the narrative that is built. So I would also like to hear if someone can speak now or maybe later in any of the discussion, where I would love to be, and I'll request Andy to call me there also. Look at how religion is helping or not so helping in addressing the issue of minority rights, because each of one claims that our religion is the best, and it provides certain securities to the religion. But then when you find things happening on street and every day's newspapers, sometimes act of horrific minority related matters. So this is one area I would also like to hear any of the experts speaking, because I'm not an expert, but I deal with this as a university professor every day.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Yeah, so Dr. Hassan requesting probably Captain Andy next discussion part 2 will deal also with this issue. It's very important. Most of conflict is related to religious issues, especially in some countries in the South, I think the South Asia, even in many other places. But in any case, are there more additional questions you want to raise, or a point of discussion that I think we can entertain at this time? He wants to talk. Mr. Albert. Captain Andy, is someone from online wants to talk? No?
No.
Okay. Oh, any other question? I have a very I'm curious, because Malaysian, I think it's the former Malaysian Prime Minister was very vocal against what's being against the Americans when you talk about the Gaza conflict at the moment. How it is being perceived by Malaysian in general? Is it being looked at more as an issue, of minority against majority, or more an issue really of Israel asserting its, dominance, though they are actually a minority even before, If you look at the history of that part of the world, so but how Malaysians are, perceiving it? Because your leaders, especially the former prime minister, very vocal.
I think Malaysia's position, whether our leaders or even the public, has been quite consistent. We've always been very pro-Palestine. I think only now the shock of the violence has definitely taken everybody off guard. But in terms of position, the only thing that I could say is that I think Malaysians, depending on who you're talking to and which community you're from, either see it as the right for, from an angle of imperialism, colonialism, or religion, because Hamas has also been very strongly connected with a number of our organizations. So that's where it kind of can be a bit convoluted in a sense. But I think, but in general, the support is definitely, it's always been solid since day one. And Israel is the one country that no Malaysian we do not recognize Israel at all. So it's one country that we can't visit. But the only thing that I would say, I think, is where Malaysia's limitation is. We are kind of vocal, but we do tend to contradict ourselves internationally at times as well. I think currently there's the biggest issue back home is at one moment we are very much for Palestine and against, but then there's a BlackRock issue back home and the big investment with that. But then again, also it's part and parcel of this international investment thing that is not very clear cut. But Malaysia is struggling to see whether it can play a bigger role within this context. Unlike, for say, Turkey or even South Africa, I think in that context, Malaysia hasn't been able to position itself pretty well.
Because when you talk about one of the basic, one of the fundamental issue of the Gaza conflict between Israel and Palestinians is self-determination, which is basically connected to the concept of this quote-unquote minority.
Yes.
So in a way, there's already a solution proposed in the UN. So countries really has to.
I think recently what came out in the news was, I think the US ambassador was saying, why can't Malaysia play a more prominent role in the peace negotiation? And our answer was that we don't even recognize Israel. So how can we play? We're significantly biased. We support for the determination of Palestine. So, but then that's also again where I think, as from a foreign policy, I'm not exactly sure how Malaysia can position itself more. But when it comes into sentiment, public sentiment is definitely it's quite solid. Yes,
I'm happy to read that. That's my personal bias. But anyway, Captain Andy, I think I would like to call on Captain Andy, but before calling him for closing remarks, I would like to thank everyone for being here. This is a very good discussion, excellent presentation from all speakers and commentators, and also intervention coming from our visitors and our guests here. Thank you so much for that wonderful exchange as well. I've learned a lot, and I really, I'm actually supposing they should not be here because there's a conflict of schedule. And then I tell them, no, I have to go there. So I said, okay, you can manage this thing. I have to go and proceed to the conference. So thank you so much. It was not, I think I've made a good decision being here. And so I'll give the floor to Captain Andy for the closing remarks. Captain Andy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anna, for your very good moderation and also Peter. I think on behalf of the full co-host, the East-West Bridge, and the Geneva Center for Security Governance, and the International Association for Human Rights and Development and Global Governance. Again, thank you very much for being part of this very important discussion. I think this is only one round. So this only laid the foundation of our discussion. So we try to find the limit of our discussion. From the next time on, we gradually identify those kind of issues we have common concerns or have common interests to develop ideas. And ideally, I think as the interest you have shown in trying to see with your own eyes the human rights position in China, I think we try to organize sometimes field trip to Xinjiang to see with your own eyes the human rights condition in Xinjiang or the Tibet region. And also to other parts of China, where also minorities are a majority population over there, like in some autonomous region, like in Ningxia, and also in like in Hunan, there is also a Miao minority, but in Xiang, in the southwestern part of the country, they are the majority population. So we would like to try to let you see with your own eyes what's the living conditions, what's their spirits, the real living condition and real spirits of those minority people. And so this is only a start. Again, thank you very much. And also let me again call on all of you to disseminate the content of discussion, in particular the initiative. I think I have to call on the East-West Bridge staff to show the title of the initiative. Can you share the paper? Yeah, full screen. Maybe we can take a picture. We have not taken a picture. I always like to take a picture. So surrounding this screen, we can take a picture. Then we end the discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we take a picture beside it.
Yeah. Maybe you have a logo or something. Put up.
Maybe next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's really nice to meet you. Very nice to meet
Thank you, thank you.
you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Andy, bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye, Andy. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having
sir.
us.
Bye-bye. Wonderful.
Yeah, just a second. Nice to meet you. I was in fact, also. Yeah, I can think. Yeah. One, two, three, four, five, 1, 2, 5. Yeah, please. So
We're balanced here already. Okay.
Okay. So that September. Wait.
No, 2, 3, okay?
1, 2, 3, cheers. Cheers.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, thank you. So we have realized that I lead you to the restaurant. Sometimes I can get it.
Andy, we have